Hi everyone, Brain the Wave Tano here, the internet's busiest music nerd. And it's time for a review of the new Nicolas Jaar record, Cenizas. This is the latest full-length LP from one of the most acclaimed electronic musicians of the past decade, Nicolas Jaar. It's hard to believe I've been listening to the man's music for almost 10 years now, and records such as Space Is Only Noise, as well as Dark Side Psychic, still sound refreshing to this day. Nick's trajectory artistically over this span of time has been a strange one though, and it's only getting stranger. From his soundtrack to an old Soviet art film to the ambient pop stylings of Sirens, and then onto the deep and somewhat outsider house of Against All Logic, the second project under this pseudonym, Nicolas just dropped this year, which makes this the second album Nick has released this year. And on this record we're met with another massive change of pace, as this album is mostly a series of semi-ambient electroacoustic pieces that are very abstract and far outside of the house stylings that Nick has built his name on. There are 13 pieces on this record, and they all cover a pretty wide range of instrumental palettes. From the watery keys and shuffling percussive noise and wailing reed leads on the track Rubble, to the track XEROX, which is a stunning drone piece, loaded with a lot of raw, pitchy instrumentation that is shrouded in ambient noise. There might be some hammered dulcimer worked into there too. Either way, the entire piece devolves into this glitchy and surreal series of edits that are actually one of the few stylistic through threads on many of these tracks, as sonically and aesthetically, there's not a whole ton weaving all of these tracks together. Somehow, despite being a disconnected series of musical vignettes, the Pomegranates record sounded more cohesive than this. While I do realize the entire record here is relatively left field and a bit heady, still, the track Mud, which is a very tribal and somewhat psychedelic journey of sorts, doesn't really compare to anything else on the album. So while Cenizas isn't exactly the most cohesive record in this somewhat ambient style that you're ever going to hear, most of the pieces are still pretty evocative. We have the opening track, VANISH, which features some ambient synthesizers matched with chilling vocal harmonies. The whole thing sounds like the start to a horrible nightmare where I see myself die with a side of sleep paralysis. Then the following track switches things up, hitting me with some ambient, almost barely there bass along with some ghostly, distantly vocals, then a lot of weird, glitchy, metallic, percussive noise, almost keeping the pace of the track. The entire thing feels like a dreamy extension of the intro, but with a slightly industrially tinged vibe. Meanwhile, the title track comes through, sounding a bit fuzzier, a bit more low fidelity. Honestly, it all sounds like a little bit of a AIA-era grouper, but with Nick's voice on top of it instead, which is relatively haunting, especially as he digs into his lower register and sings very close to the microphone. It's like a poltergeist is in my ear, reciting some odd incantation. And though it's a big instrumental change, I think the record's surreal and somewhat fear-inducing vibe continues onto the song AGOSTO, where Nicolas gives us some howling reeds set against some ringing, dreary pianos that all eventually fracture into these glitchy synthesizer runs. It's an odd transition, but somehow it works. But from here, I think Nick does start to lose what little cohesion the album has going for it so far, especially with the track Goche, where it sounds like we get more hammered dulcimer along with this very sharp and woody type of rolling percussion. Despite the instrumentation on this track sounding so organic, it all comes off very alien and otherworldly. The piece is pretty meditative and has a cool start, but I didn't think there was much in the way of an interesting progression on this track, with the percussion becoming more and more grating and those plucky runs of tones just become so aggressive and just very messy and I guess obnoxious. Meanwhile, the track Mud I alluded to earlier is like a trippy neo-psych powwow with some primal drums and drones. On top of that, Nicolas's very fuzzy voice, soaked in delay, and the whole performance sounds like he is just stuck in some sort of trance, especially as he begins to shout. Instrumentation gets thicker, and while the progression is pretty slow, I do like the end point, which is a pretty nice payoff, as everything gets a bit jammier. Feels like it's a lot more in the moment. Every piece of instrumentation just embellishing a little bit here and there, digging more into the groove. The drone at the end of this track follows right into the next one in a bit of a segue. But on top of the drone now, we get these wheezy, harmonies of what sounds like either horn or strings. It's difficult to tell as it's so warped and melty. Sounds like the kind of mood piece you would produce if you took all of your instrumentation and recording equipment to a silent monk commune and just isolated yourself there for a year. The song Sunder, which didn't really impress me all that much originally as a single, does make a lot more sense within the context of this track list. The cycling organ synths on the track work very nicely against Nick's very low-key voice and lost transmission sound effects that really light up certain moments of the track. It's a cool progression, very low-key, very subtle, and I love how the synths lightly contort as the song moves along, just jumping up and down in a somewhat spastic but quiet way here and there. My number one issue with the track now is that it ends a little abruptly, and it is one of a few tracks here that I do wish extended a bit further. The track Hello Chain brings another change of pace with a weirdly angelic vocal harmony intro, which ends and then brings us another series of vocal harmonies that sounds like a different progression, different singers, different recording. Either way, this new section is what the bulk of the song indulges in, and this series of harmonies sounds a bit more operatic, I guess. The mix of vocals is colored occasionally with these bright harmonic shots of tones and synths. It's pretty bold. The ending of the album is not all that bad either. RUBBLE and XEROX tracks that I mentioned earlier are easily two of the better pieces here, even if those wailing reed solos on the former come on pretty strong. Then there's Garden that kicks off with these cycling meditative piano phrases that make me feel like I'm locked into the intro of a James Blake song that never quite ends or resolves, as the progression of this track is pretty much non-existent. And Faith Made of Silk, the closing track, is maybe the most lively piece of music on the entire record, as it features a very booming bit of percussion that is pretty groovy, strong pulse to it, decidedly Latin too. Nick colors this with some ringing synthesizers, comatose vocals, and in a way, it sounds like a bit of an offshoot of something off of Radiohead's King of Limbs, in a good way. Although the piece's very depressive and ascending chord progression read to me as a bit more Kid A or even Amnesiac. Still, it's really the drums on this track that steal the show as they get more intense as they move along and hit a bit of a fever pitch at the very end, where they cut off abruptly and we are met with quite a bit of silence toward the tail of the track, which I suppose just gives me some much needed space to reflect on everything I just heard. Because this was a pretty perplexing semi-ambient record, and still, while I do wish some tracks extended and maybe that there was a narrower focus instrumentally, I still had a lot of fun with it. I loved it, actually. I thought it was wonderfully reflective as well as mind-bending. Some might call this album kind of trippy as well, although for me personally, I thought it was kind of sober in tone, in that you are just isolating yourself in your mind, facing down your dark side, facing down your demons, and just essentially exercising musically and artistically whatever comes as a result of that. Feeling a light 8 on this one. Transition, have you given this album a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best, you're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like. Please subscribe and please don't cry. Hit the bell as well. Over here next to my head is another video that you should check out. Hit that up, or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, Nicolas Jaar, forever.